This vlog is about Lim, obviously. The visual design of the game is similar to those of games like World's Hardest Games and other puzzle-like games on the internet, where the player takes control of a unit, and in this game a square, and moves the square through a puzzle in a maze, or a maze. The square's color controls the actions of some nearby squares. If the square is a different color than the other squares will attack the player, quote unquote attack, so that it is very hard, if not impossible, to continue. The player can even be thrown outside of the main maze to the outside, yet it is still possible to complete the game from the out of bounds. If the player decides to blend to the other shapes, the camera zooms in very slowly on the player's square. I actually tried out, I held down the blend button for like a couple minutes, and the whole square took up the entire screen. Furthermore, there's a violent shaking of the objects uh, in the environment, and the scope of vision becomes narrow and narrower. However, using blend is necessary to get past the attacking squares. Visually, it's very easy to understand what's going on, and the mechanics of the game are pretty obvious once you first interact, or after your first interaction with other squares. It becomes pretty obvious what the mechanics of the game are. The game's audio is kind of strange. When the player blends, there's like an air horn and like a squeezing noise to indicate that the player is blending. And if the player blends for long enough, there are like bleeps occasionally as the player continuously holds down the button. There is no background music or theme music to the game, so when you're not blending, it's just like silent. Also, if the player is being attacked by the other squares, there's a sound to indicate the contact and movement of the pieces, which can get very loud and pretty like disrupt. Like it's pretty like a destructive noise. Um, and if you're being attacked by like, a lot of squares, it sounds very violent. The game interaction design is based around blend primarily and trying to maneuver through and around the maze. The blend button is the main interaction, along with the simple move commands that dictate the outcome of the player. Colored squares, for the most part, can be interacted with. If the player is the same color as the other squares, like previously mentioned, the other squares do nothing. However, if the player is a different color, the other squares impede and attack the player's progress. The ending of the game is that a square flashes a lot of colors. In the game itself, there's like the two primary colors, like an orangish and a purplish. However, at the end, it goes to like yellow, teal, red, all this. And the player score does the same. And then the ending screen, the winning screen, presumably, the screen just goes black. The game itself wasn't particularly difficult. The main problem I had was judging the distance the other squares reacted to, like what their trigger radius was. Sometimes when I thought I was far enough away or I was free that I could not use the blend tool, I was still in range of the attacking square's trigger radius. And sometimes the attacking squares can, when you move through one room, there's like a gate that closes. But sometimes if you let go of the blend too soon, they can go to the next room with you and they'll start attacking you in there as well. And then it becomes very hard to use the blend tool effectively. Um, the other squares, also if you don't blend correctly, the other squares would block the route to further the maze. So I had to reset. So like sometimes the colored, like the orange or purple blocks, would just like not the maze itself, but like the attacking squares would like go right in the way of the like the route, so I couldn't continue. So I had to reset. Another frustrating part of the blend tool was like that you're slowed down a lot, and the screen becomes like very annoying to look at, or like disruptive to look at, and it becomes increasingly harder to see where you're going while using the blend mechanic because of the narrow field of vision. Specifically drawing on last class's material, I can see a metaphor and connection to Lim and the issues of race and ethnicity that were discussed. If the player wasn't the same color as the other squares, he was attacked. And if we take the squares to represent people, which potentially they can be referenced as or not, they could be other objects as well, then the squares are attacking the player based simply on color. While the game in it itself isn't racist, if we use this metaphor that I just mentioned, we see an overarching racist theme to the game, and specifically to the attacking squares, where the player must assimilate to the other square's race, quote unquote, in order to move by. And the mechanic to assimilate becomes the blend tool, which is a very ineffective and a very frustrating mechanic to use. So if we take that and put that into real life, it becomes it becomes harder for people to assimilate to other people's races and ethnicities, according to the metaphor of the game. And at the end of the game, like I said before, when the player presumably wins, quote unquote, the squares are changing colors rapidly, and also the squares are changing between many colors, not just the two that are used during the game. So that's um if the game itself is this overarching racist theme, the end of the game, because there's like all the colors represented. I believe that would then be like the non-racist part of the game, where like you have to get to the you have to experience the racism in order to not get in order to get to like the non-racist part. I don't know if that makes sense, but that's kind of how I see it.